trade and treaties. When colonists and indigenous nations sat down to negotiate, they rarely began with words. They began with gifts, food, rituals, and above all, trust. Trade was not just commerce, it was diplomacy, survival, and a statement of power. To understand the alliances and rivalries of colonial America, we must understand how wampum belts, furs, and ritual feasts carried more weight than pen and paper. 1. Trade as diplomacy. For many native nations, trade was not a side activity. It was the heartbeat of diplomacy. To exchange goods was to acknowledge a relationship, a bond between people. When the French and English first arrived, they entered a world where commerce and diplomacy were inseparable. In indigenous traditions, giving meant creating obligation. A gift of food or tools was not just generosity. It demanded reciprocity, respect, and recognition of friendship. Europeans, however, often misread these exchanges as mere bartering. This misunderstanding would shape the entire future of colonial diplomacy. 2. Wampum belts as diplomatic tools. No symbol captures indigenous diplomacy better than the wampum belt. Crafted from purple and white shells, wampum belts were not money, as Europeans once thought. They were living records, sacred texts woven in beads. Each belt told a story, of peace agreed upon, of promises kept, or of alliances broken. When an indigenous leader presented a wampum belt, it was not an empty gesture. It was a contract, a spiritual bond, backed by the authority of the community and the ancestors. The French, more willing to respect this symbolism, often incorporated wampum into their treaties. The English, however, were slower to grasp its importance, leading to frequent breakdowns in trust. 3. The fur trade and power dynamics. The beaver, a creature that built dams and shaped landscapes, became the cornerstone of a new political world. Furs were highly prized in Europe, fueling fashions and fortunes. Indigenous hunters became powerful middlemen, deciding who received access to pelts and who was shut out. For the French in Canada, alliances with indigenous traders like the Huron were essential. The English, meanwhile, sought to bypass native middlemen, igniting bitter competition. These rivalries were not just about trade. They shifted balances of power, creating winners and losers among indigenous nations themselves. Some nations grew stronger through control of trade routes, while others were pushed into conflict. 4. French versus English diplomatic styles. The French approached diplomacy with rituals of hospitality. They smoked pipes, shared meals, and treated alliances as kinship bonds. This approach often made them more successful in winning allies. The English, by contrast, preferred rigid treaties, legal documents, and land deeds. To native leaders, the English way seemed cold, distant, and binding in ways they had not agreed to. The contrast was striking. A French council might end with laughter, feasts, and gifts exchanged. An English council might end with signatures on paper that meant little to indigenous participants who valued spoken and symbolic bonds above written ones. 5. Gifts, rituals, and symbolism. Diplomacy in indigenous America was rich with ritual. Feasts were not luxuries, they were negotiations. A council fire was not just a setting, it was a sacred presence. When gifts of food, beads, and tools were exchanged, they affirmed trust. When pipes were smoked, it was more than hospitality. It was a prayer, binding both sides in mutual respect. For Europeans unfamiliar with these customs, such rituals often seemed unnecessary. But for native leaders, without ritual, words had no weight. Without gifts, treaties had no spirit. 6. Tensions in trade and exploitation. As fur, corn, and other resources flowed into European hands, tensions grew. Trade became less about reciprocity and more about control. Some indigenous nations warned of imbalance. When the exchange no longer carried respect, diplomacy broke. European hunger for furs, land, and profit turned allies into rivals. Promises made in wampum could be ignored once paper treaties were signed. And as imbalance deepened, indigenous diplomacy was tested to its limits, forcing leaders to decide when to trust, when to resist, and when to fight. Trade was never just about goods. It was about survival, honor, and sovereignty. To native nations, the beaver pelt or wampum belt was not a commodity. It was a language, a symbol, a contract. To Europeans, it became a way to gain wealth, power, and land. This clash of meaning would shape the fragile alliances of the 17th century. Alliances that could hold for a season but collapse in betrayal the next. Trade built bridges, but it also sowed divisions. In the world of colonial diplomacy, every gift carried both promise and danger. War, peace, and fragile alliances. Diplomacy in colonial America was never simple. Every handshake, every gift, every wampum belt carried more than goodwill. It carried risk. For indigenous nations, alliances with Europeans could bring survival and power, but also betrayal and destruction. For the colonists, alliances with native nations were often the only thing that stood between survival and starvation. Yet every treaty was fragile, balanced on a knife's edge between peace and war. Indigenous strategies of balance. Native leaders were not passive players. They knew the power of choice. By aligning with one European power against another, they preserved autonomy and secured better terms. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known as the Iroquois, mastered this art. They played the French and English against one another, striking deals that ensured their influence stretched across the Northeast. For the Powhatan in Virginia, the Wampanoag in New England, and the Huron in Canada, alliances were lifelines. Sometimes, friendship meant survival. But these friendships came with heavy costs, as indigenous nations became entangled in European wars and rivalries. Rivalries between European powers. The New World was not just a stage for indigenous diplomacy, it was also a battlefield for European empires. The French, English, Dutch, and Spanish all sought alliances to strengthen their positions. For native nations, this competition was both opportunity and danger. The French cultivated close kinship with their allies, often intermarrying and respecting ceremonial traditions. The English, more rigid and land-hungry, offered weapons and trade, but demanded territory. The Dutch, though short-lived, introduced firearms into the Hudson Valley, shifting balances of power in ways that reshaped diplomacy for decades. The Beaver Wars. No rivalry demonstrates the stakes of these alliances more than the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. Fueled by European demand for pelts, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy expanded aggressively, attacking rival tribes such as the Huron, Erie, and Susquehannock. Their access to European firearms gave them a deadly edge. This was not just a native conflict, it was shaped by European trade and rivalry. The French armed their allies, the Huron, while the English and Dutch supplied the Haudenosaunee. In this way, indigenous diplomacy became entangled in a larger web of global commerce and empire. Alliances in New England. In New England, the Wampanoag forged a crucial alliance with the Plymouth colonists through Massasoit, a relationship that ensured the survival of the struggling English settlement. But even this bond was fragile. Within a generation, miscommunication, broken promises, and hunger for land led to King Philip's War, one of the most devastating conflicts in early American history. This war showed how quickly alliances could unravel. What began with feasts and promises of friendship ended in bloodshed, with native communities torn apart and colonists hardened in their hunger for expansion. The role of ritual and symbolism in war and peace. Even during times of war, diplomacy never disappeared. Councils still met. Wampum belts were still exchanged. Peace negotiations were still framed with ritual, feasting, and smoking of pipes. For native nations, even enemies could become allies again if diplomacy was restored. For Europeans, this was harder to grasp. They tended to see treaties as permanent, rather than fluid agreements subject to renewal. This difference in worldview made peace fragile. To native leaders, a treaty was a living thing. It needed to be reaffirmed with gifts and ritual. To colonists, Once words were written on paper, they believed the matter was settled. The gap between these views was often a spark for renewed conflict, fragile bonds, and lasting consequences. By the late 1600s, indigenous diplomacy was both powerful and perilous. Nations who played alliances wisely could secure weapons, trade, and relative safety. Those who miscalculated could lose everything. The balance of power shifted constantly, like a fire that had to be tended or it would burn out. The legacy of these fragile alliances is clear. Indigenous nations shaped the destiny of colonial America just as much as European settlers. They were not silent victims. They were diplomats, warriors, negotiators, and strategists, often making choices in impossible circumstances. Alliances in colonial America were not written in stone. They were woven like wampum belts, bead by bead, promise by promise, always in danger of being broken. Indigenous nations understood that survival required both strength and subtlety. Europeans, blinded by empire and land hunger, often saw alliances as temporary tools. Yet in this fragile dance of war and peace, diplomacy remained central. The story of colonial America is not only one of conquest, it is also one of negotiation, resilience, and the constant struggle to balance peace with power. Diplomacy during conflicts. War in colonial America was never just fought with weapons. It was fought with words, rituals, and negotiations. Even as battles raged, council fires still burned. For indigenous nations, diplomacy did not end when war began. It became even more urgent. Survival depended not only on strength in arms, but on skill in negotiation. The nature of conflict diplomacy. When conflict broke out, diplomacy became a lifeline. Leaders gathered not just to plot war, but to prepare for peace. In indigenous traditions, war and diplomacy were two sides of the same fire. A battle might secure territory, but only negotiation could secure the future. Unlike European warfare, where treaties were signed after victory, indigenous diplomacy often continued during conflict itself. Envoys were sent, wampum exchanged, and messages carried across enemy lines. This fluid approach meant that even rivals could return to the council table when the moment was right. Peacemakers in the midst of violence. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, indigenous leaders rose as peacemakers in the darkest of times. In New England, after the devastation of King Philip's War, some leaders sought new arrangements with colonial governors to protect their remaining people. In the Great Lakes, after brutal clashes in the Beaver Wars, Haudenosaunee leaders negotiated truces with the French, knowing endless war would drain both sides. These moments of diplomacy did not erase the violence, but they kept nations alive. Each negotiation was a chance to preserve culture, land, and future generations. The symbolism of war councils. Even during conflict, war councils were sacred spaces. Leaders sat around fires, smoking pipes, and invoking ancestors. War belts of wampum, colored with red beads, were exchanged to declare hostilities. Later, white wampum belts could be presented to signal peace. This symbolic language carried weight far beyond weapons. To indigenous nations, war itself was bound by diplomacy. It had rules, rituals, and pathways back to peace. To Europeans, these customs were foreign, but for native leaders, they were essential to restoring balance. Case study: the Haudenosaunee and the French. In the late 17th century, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy fought bitterly against French forces and their native allies. Villages were burned, warriors captured, blood spilled across New France. Yet even at the height of violence, negotiations continued. French missionaries carried messages of peace. Haudenosaunee envoys traveled to Montreal with belts of wampum. By 1701, these efforts culminated in the Great Peace of Montreal, a treaty that brought together more than 30 nations in a single diplomatic triumph. It proved that even after decades of war, indigenous diplomacy could restore stability. Case study: the Southeastern nations. In the Southeast, nations like the Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw faced constant pressures from English, French, and Spanish colonies. Rivalries often drew them into conflicts. Yet here, too, diplomacy was central. Leaders balanced competing European powers, offering warriors to one side while negotiating peace with another. During Queen Anne's War, for example, native leaders used alliances as bargaining chips, shifting sides when necessary to preserve autonomy. These strategies showed that war did not erase diplomacy, it sharpened it. The fragility of peace. Peace was always fragile. Treaties signed during conflicts could be broken overnight. Colonists often failed to honor promises, expanding onto native lands even after agreements. For indigenous leaders, this meant every treaty required constant renewal. Every bond needed tending, like a fire that could not be left to burn out. This fragility bred mistrust. Some nations withdrew from alliances, focusing on survival within their own borders. Others doubled down on diplomacy, trying again and again to forge peace, even when betrayal seemed inevitable. Diplomacy during conflict reveals the resilience of indigenous nations. They fought when they had to, but they never abandoned the council fire. They knew that true strength was not only measured in warriors, but in the ability to negotiate peace. In colonial America, war and diplomacy were never separate. They were intertwined, a constant dance between destruction and survival. And through it all, indigenous leaders proved themselves not just as warriors, but as diplomats of remarkable vision and endurance. The 1700s and evolving diplomacy opening. The 1700s brought a new stage for diplomacy in North America. This was no longer a world of first encounters. It was a world of entangled empires, rising conflicts, and indigenous nations adapting with extraordinary resilience. Native diplomacy did not fade in this century. It evolved, reaching new levels of sophistication as nations faced an ever-changing balance of power. A century of change. By the 18th century, indigenous nations were no longer strangers to European colonists. They had decades of experience dealing with the English, French, Dutch, and Spanish. They had survived wars, plagues, and betrayals, but they had also built alliances, secured trade networks, and defended sovereignty. Colonial America was now shaped by global rivalries. France and England struggled for dominance in North America. Spain held territories to the south, and indigenous leaders became the crucial diplomats, balancing these powers to protect their people. Diplomacy in a global war. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, was not simply a clash of empires, it was also a contest of alliances. Both Britain and France desperately sought indigenous support. Tribes across the Northeast, Great Lakes, and Ohio Valley faced difficult choices: who to side with, who to resist, and when to remain neutral. For indigenous leaders, these choices were never simple. Aligning with the French or British might bring guns and trade, but it also carried risks if their side lost. Neutrality could preserve independence, but only if both empires respected it, which often they did not. The role of confederacies and coalitions. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy remained central in this century. Their covenant chain diplomacy with the British was a powerful alliance, yet it required constant renewal through councils and wampum. Meanwhile, smaller nations sought strength through coalitions of their own, resisting colonial encroachment with unity. In the southeast, the Creek Confederacy emerged as a formidable diplomatic force. By uniting towns and clans, Creek leaders built a flexible system of negotiation with European powers. Their strategies often placed them in the role of power brokers, able to shift the balance between rival empires. Key figures of the century. The 1700s saw extraordinary indigenous diplomats. Canassatego, an Onondaga chief, gave speeches that not only guided Haudenosaunee policy, but also influenced American colonists, who admired the unity of the Confederacy. Atakulakula, a Cherokee diplomat, skillfully navigated between British and French alliances, protecting Cherokee autonomy for decades. Pontiac, an Odawa leader, demonstrated that diplomacy and war could combine. Organizing resistance after the French defeat, but also negotiating with British officers to defend native lands. These leaders reveal that diplomacy in the 1700s was not static. It was dynamic, personal, and visionary. Rituals of renewal. Even as the century brought new pressures, Indigenous diplomacy retained its deep traditions. Ceremonial councils, gift exchanges, pipe rituals, and wampum belts remained the foundation of agreements. European officials often underestimated these rituals, but Indigenous leaders insisted on them. They understood that without ritual, treaties lacked legitimacy. This was diplomacy as both performance and reality, a blending of sacred tradition with political necessity, shifting power and broken promises. Despite all the skill of Indigenous diplomacy, the 1700s brought deeper challenges. Colonists pushed westward, hungry for land. British victories after the French and Indian War expanded their control but eroded trust with native allies. Promises made in wartime were often ignored in peace. Yet Indigenous leaders adapted. They petitioned governors, traveled across oceans to London, and continued to demand recognition. Their diplomacy now spanned continents, proof of their determination to be heard on the world stage. The 1700s reveal Indigenous diplomacy at its height, creative, resilient, and far-reaching. In a world where empires clashed and colonies grew, native nations stood as diplomats of remarkable skill. They were not passive observers of history. They were active negotiators, shaping events with every council, every belt, and every alliance. Even as colonial power expanded, Indigenous diplomacy never disappeared. It evolved, proving again that survival was not just a matter of strength, but of wisdom at the council fire. Women in diplomacy. When we think of diplomacy in colonial America, we often imagine chiefs, warriors, and colonial governors. But behind many of the greatest decisions stood the voices of women. For Indigenous nations, diplomacy was never only a man's domain. Women held the power of the hearth, the land, and the generations to come. And when it came to survival, their influence could shape peace or war. The central role of women in governance. In many Indigenous societies, women held political authority that Europeans struggled to understand. Among the Haudenosaunee, clan mothers chose the chiefs and could remove them if they failed their duties. Women's voices shaped councils, influencing alliances, treaties, and strategies. To colonists, this was shocking. European diplomacy was a man's world, but for Indigenous nations, women were the guardians of balance, ensuring decisions protected not only warriors, but children and future generations. Women as negotiators and messengers. In times of tension, women often carried messages between nations. Their presence symbolized peace and continuity, reminding both sides of shared humanity. In some cases, they served as mediators when conflict seemed impossible to resolve. Stories tell of women who walked into enemy camps, not with weapons, but with words, to stop bloodshed. Their bravery made them both peacemakers and protectors. Diplomacy through marriage alliances. Another form of diplomacy came through marriage. In native traditions, intermarriage could cement alliances between clans, nations, or even with Europeans. For example, in the early fur trade era, marriages between native women and French traders created kinship ties that smoothed trade and peace. These unions were not simply personal, they were political. Through them, Indigenous women ensured their people gained influence, goods, and connections that could be used for survival. Cultural interpreters and knowledge keepers. Indigenous women often became cultural interpreters, bridging the gap between worlds. They taught languages, explained rituals, and guided European envoys through the protocols of diplomacy. Without them, many treaties might never have been signed. Their knowledge of traditions, geography, and diplomacy turned them into quiet yet decisive figures in shaping history. Case study: the Haudenosaunee clan. Haudenosaunee clan mothers, are perhaps the most famous example of women in diplomacy. Their role in selecting and guiding chiefs ensured that no leader could act without accountability. When treaties were debated, their voices carried immense weight. Colonial officials often dismissed this influence until they realized no treaty was valid unless clan mothers approved. Their authority was not symbolic, it was political reality. The legacy of women's influence. Though colonial narratives rarely mentioned them, Indigenous women shaped diplomacy at every level. They chose leaders, forged alliances, maintained peace, and even crossed cultural boundaries through marriage and negotiation. Their legacy lives on. The influence of clan mothers inspired some American colonists to imagine new forms of democracy, where accountability and consensus were central. Indigenous diplomacy was not just the work of warriors and chiefs. It was a collective effort rooted in balance and continuity. Women stood at its heart as decision-makers, negotiators, and guardians of the future. Without them, diplomacy in colonial America would not have survived. They were the unseen architects of peace, carrying the voices of generations in every council fire.